What happens when a respected black veteran faces ruthless bullies in his own hometown? You won't believe how his powerful response flips the script and leaves everyone speechless. James Wilson was the kind of man who made everyone feel like they mattered. At 62 years old, he carried himself with a dignified grace that hinted at a life filled with sacrifice, honor, and battles that weren't always fought on distant shores. A decorated Army veteran, James had served with distinction, and though the medals on his chest had faded, the pride in his eyes remained sharp as ever. This particular morning was typical in its start, but not in its end. James, with his broad, genuine smile, walked toward the local school. He volunteered there regularly, helping kids struggling with math. He knew how important education was, especially in neighborhoods where opportunities came as often as winning lottery tickets, rare and usually disappointing. James had a soft spot for these children. Lord knows somebody has to care, he often joked, though beneath his humor lay a somber acknowledgement of life's unfairness. As James neared the schoolyard, he noticed a group of men loitering nearby. Their stance, their scowls, and their whispered exchanges sent a cold shiver down his spine. But James had faced worse, far worse, and he refused to be intimidated by some grown men acting like playground bullies. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," shouted a young boy, waving enthusiastically. "Good morning, Marcus," James replied warmly. Marcus struggled with algebra, but excelled in making James laugh, something James valued just as highly. Before James could reach the school's entrance, the group of men blocked his path, forming a wall of hostility. The tallest among them, sporting a cocky grin and a faded denim jacket, stepped forward. "What do you think you're doing here, old man?" he sneered, eyes narrowed with contempt. James paused, took a deep breath, and gave his best diplomatic smile. "Helping these kids find a future. Something you boys ought to try someday." "Funny," said another man, shorter and stockier, stepping closer. "We don't need folks like you filling their heads with ideas." "Ideas like hope and respect?" James retorted sharply, sarcasm dripping from his words. "Heaven forbid these children grow up decent." The stocky man's expression hardened, and without warning, he grabbed James's arm tightly. "Watch your mouth, old-timer." James clenched his jaw, anger rising like mercury on a hot day, but he kept his composure. He stared directly into the man's eyes, voice steady. "You might want to take your hand off me, son. Respect isn't a suggestion." The tense standoff drew an anxious crowd of students and teachers to the school's windows. Suddenly, the school principal, Mr. Carter, stormed out of the building, his presence imposing enough to scatter most troublemakers. "Gentlemen," Mr. Carter announced sternly, "you need to leave. Now." The group reluctantly backed off, casting venomous glances at James. As they retreated, the denim-jacketed leader spat out a final threat. "We'll see you again, old man." James shook off the tension, though the anger lingered. He straightened his jacket and nodded gratefully at Mr. Carter. "Thanks for stepping in." "You shouldn't have to thank me," Carter replied grimly. "Not in this day and age," James chuckled bitterly. "Day and age ain't never been friendly to men like me." "But we keep trying, don't we?" They exchanged a knowing glance, heavy with decades of shared frustrations. James walked inside, greeted by worried faces and hushed whispers. He reassured the kids with a bright smile, masking the turmoil within. "All right now," he declared firmly, breaking the uneasy silence. "Let's tackle those algebra equations. Lord knows math problems make more sense than some grown folks out there." A ripple of laughter filled the room, but James knew deep down that trouble wasn't over. It was just beginning. What happened next changed everything. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. James knew something had shifted in the air after that confrontation. The stares lingered a bit too long, whispers hissed a bit too loud. But James Wilson wasn't the type of man to back down, not after the life he'd lived. He knew you couldn't let ignorance grow unchecked. It had a nasty habit of becoming comfortable. The next evening found James at St. Mary's Church, handing out meals to folks who needed more than just spiritual nourishment. Father Thompson was always grateful for James's help, jokingly calling him Saint James. James would always reply with a sharp grin, "I'm just paying off my tab upstairs, Father." Tonight, though, that humor dried up quickly. James spotted familiar faces lurking just beyond the glow of the street lamps, the same crew who had hassled him at the school. They approached with slow, deliberate steps, their grins wide and malevolent. The leader, still in that denim jacket that looked like it belonged back in the Reagan era, stepped forward. "Look here, the hero feeding the bums," he mocked loudly, drawing uneasy glances from everyone around. James raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Bums? Son, if your mama heard you talk that way, she'd slap some manners back into you." The crowd chuckled nervously, but the tension crackled like dry leaves underfoot. "Funny guy, huh?" Another man snarled, his eyes flashing dangerously. Without warning, he overturned the table piled with food, scattering plates and cups across the pavement. Chaos erupted as people scrambled away. James felt heat rising from his chest to his ears, his fist clenching instinctively, but he kept his voice steady, glaring fiercely at the group. "You boys must feel real proud bullying folks who can't fight back. Takes real courage to knock over a table full of sandwiches, doesn't it?" "Watch your tone," growled Denim Jacket, stepping threateningly closer. His voice dripped menace. "We don't need your type stirring things up around here." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head slowly. "My type? You mean the type who fought so boys like you could have the freedom to act like idiots? You're welcome." Denim Jacket lunged forward, shoving James hard, sending him sprawling painfully onto the cold, unforgiving concrete. Gasps erupted around them as smartphones flashed to life, recording every humiliating second. James's head spun, anger and humiliation pulsing through every fiber of his being. He rose slowly, dignity frayed, but intact, brushing dirt from his clothing as he glared defiantly at his attackers. "Y'all better hope your parents aren't watching. Nothing worse than grown men behaving like spoiled children." The approaching sirens finally broke the oppressive tension. Blue lights flooded the scene, causing the aggressors to scatter quickly into the shadows. Officer Davis stepped out of the patrol car, face tight with concern. "James, you all right?" James managed a grim smile, nodding stiffly. "Just another night, officer." Davis looked around, disgusted at the ruined meals scattered across the street. "This ain't right." James met his gaze squarely, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Hasn't been right for a long time, has it?" James stood there surrounded by whispers and flashing cameras, fully aware that the quiet life he cherished was unraveling rapidly. Yet even amidst the turmoil, a defiant fire burned brightly inside him. He knew this fight wasn't over. It had just begun. This is the moment you've been waiting for. The climax is just around the corner. Stay tuned to see how James finally sets everyone straight. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, much like James felt inside. The incident at St. Mary's had become a viral sensation overnight, spreading rapidly across social media and local news channels. His phone buzzed incessantly, flooded with messages of support and indignation, but also some hateful comments that reminded him exactly why he couldn't let this go quietly. James wasn't one to crave attention, but this fight felt deeply personal. He dressed deliberately, choosing his best suit, crisp and authoritative. Today wasn't about him. It was about sending a message loud enough to pierce through ignorance and hate. The town hall meeting that evening was packed to the rafters, charged with expectation. When James stepped onto the stage, applause erupted spontaneously. His gaze scanned the faces in the audience. Friends, neighbors, veterans he had served with, and yes, even those troublemakers lurking quietly at the back. His eyes narrowed, locking onto Denim Jacket, who stared back defiantly. "Y'all must think you're pretty special," James began, his voice commanding yet calm. "Acting tough, knocking down old men, flipping over tables of sandwiches meant for folks who've had enough bad days already. Takes some special kind of courage to be that small." Laughter and murmurs rippled through the crowd. James leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "You see, courage ain't about pushing people around. Courage is showing up day after day, doing what's right even when folks treat you like dirt. Courage is fighting for your country, then coming home to fight for your community. Courage is something cowards wouldn't understand. The room fell silent, every eye glued to James. He could feel the emotion rising in his chest, raw and powerful. I served this country because I believed in it. I believed that someday we'd be past all this foolishness. But here we are, still fighting battles I thought we'd settled decades ago. He paused, letting his words sink in, before continuing with a fiery determination. Enough is enough. If you're comfortable in your ignorance, get uncomfortable real quick. We're done tolerating this nonsense. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, a collective release of pent-up frustration and hope. Even some hesitant faces in the back seemed affected, shifting awkwardly, unable to meet his gaze. Suddenly, Sheriff Roberts stepped forward, his expression solemn. He reached out to shake James's hand firmly. "Mr. Wilson, I owe you an apology. You deserve better, and you'll get better. These men will face consequences. That's a promise." Denim Jacket and his crew shifted uneasily, eyes darting nervously as officers quietly moved in. Sheriff Roberts continued, turning to the crowd. "This town stands for respect, dignity, and fairness. Anyone who can't grasp that is welcome to find somewhere else to live." James nodded, gratitude and vindication clear on his face. Justice isn't always swift, but when it arrives, it hits harder than any punch. That evening, James walked home under the warm glow of streetlights, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Justice hadn't erased all the pain, but it had started something important. A conversation, a reckoning. And James Wilson, with a determined stride and his head held high, knew he'd keep fighting, because some battles were simply too important to lose.